A man walked into a luxury car dealership in Los Angeles, carrying nothing but a 6-year-old girl on his hip and a quiet look in his eyes. He wasn't dressed to impress. That was intentional. Within 10 minutes, the floor manager walked up to him, picked up a glass of water from the reception desk, and threw it directly in his face in front of everyone. Staff looked away. Customers pretended not to notice. One junior sales associate was the only person who moved toward him. The man dried his face, said 7 words to the manager, and left. The next morning he came back, and everything changed. The name on the building read, Luxora Motors, in brushed chrome letters mounted against a facade of floor-to-ceiling glass that caught the California morning light and threw it back like a warning. The showroom sat on a corner lot in West Los Angeles, the kind of address that cost more per square foot than most people's entire apartments. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented leather money, and something engineered to make people feel like they had arrived somewhere important. The cars on the floor were polished to a shine that made them look less like vehicles and more like sculptures. Everything about the place was designed to tell you before a single word was spoken that not everyone belonged here. Vanessa Cole had worked at Luxora Motors for 6 years, and she understood that message better than anyone. She was the floor manager, sharp-dressed, sharp-eyed, and sharper still when it came to reading a room. She could identify a serious buyer within 30 seconds of them walking through the door, the way they moved the watch on their wrist, the confidence in their step. She had built her reputation on turning high-value clients into closed deals, and she protected that floor like it was hers. In many ways, she acted as though it was. Jason Miller had been at Luxora Motors for less than 3 months. He was 26, still learning the product catalog, still figuring out the unspoken rules of the showroom floor. He wasn't cynical yet. He still made eye contact with every customer who walked in, regardless of what they were wearing. His colleagues had already started to find that slightly irritating. Mark Reynolds, the showroom director, ran the operation from a glass-walled office at the back of the floor. He was not unkind, but he was pragmatic in a way that had, over the years, quietly replaced his instincts about people with instincts about numbers. He tracked revenue-monitored conversion rates and trusted Vanessa to keep the floor running the way he liked it, clean, professional, and profitable. Daniel Brooks arrived at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. He drove himself, no driver, no assistant, and parked a 2-year-old sedan 3 blocks away and walked the rest. He was wearing a plain white button-down shirt, khaki trousers, and shoes that had been resoled at least once. He was carrying Emma on his left hip. She was 6 years old, dark-eyed, and holding a small insulated water bottle with both hands, the kind designed for children decorated with printed stars. Daniel had brought her because his usual childcare had fallen through that morning, and he hadn't wanted to reschedule. He had been planning this visit for weeks. What no one on that showroom floor knew, what Daniel had not told anyone outside his executive team, was that he was not there as a customer. He was the founder and principal shareholder of Aurora Automotive Group, the parent company that owned Luxora Motors, along with 11 other dealerships across 5 states. For the better part of 4 months, internal reports had been flagging the same location, Luxora Motors, West Los Angeles, complaints from customers who felt they had been assessed and dismissed before a single salesperson had approached them. A pattern of selective service, attentive to clients who looked the part, cold to everyone else. The reports were consistent enough that Daniel had decided to see it for himself, without warning, without the filter that came with being recognized. He had done this before at other locations. It was the only way to know what was actually happening on the floor. He stepped through the front door and set Emma down beside him, keeping her hand in his. She looked up at the cars with wide eyes and immediately pointed at a white convertible near the center of the room. Daniel smiled and let her pull him a step closer. They stood there for a moment, just the two of them taking it in. No one approached them. 2 sales associates on the far side of the floor made brief eye contact with Daniel and looked away. A third was busy with a couple who had arrived in a car Daniel recognized as a current-year luxury import, and so that associate's attention was entirely elsewhere. Vanessa was near the reception desk, speaking with a man in a tailored suit, the kind of client the floor had been designed for. She noticed Daniel and Emma the moment they walked in. She said nothing, but she watched. Jason was the only one who moved. He had been restocking brochures near the entrance when Daniel arrived, and he walked over within the first 2 minutes, introducing himself simply and asking if there was anything he could help them find. Daniel told him they were just looking, that he wanted to get a sense of the floor. Jason nodded and offered to answer questions whenever they were ready, then stepped back without hovering. It was by any reasonable standard exactly how the interaction should have gone. Emma, meanwhile, had grown restless. She had finished most of the water in her bottle and was trying to open it to refill it from a water station she had spotted near the reception desk. She wasn't running, wasn't loud. She was simply a 6-year-old, moving through a space that had not been designed with 6-year-olds in mind. The bottle slipped. The lid, not fully closed, came loose on impact, and a small amount of water spread across the marble floor near the base of the reception desk. It was not a dramatic spill. It was the kind of thing that happened in any public space and was cleaned up in 30 seconds. Vanessa had seen it from across the room. She excused herself from her client and walked over. The walk itself carried a particular quality, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of walk that communicated authority before a word was spoken. She stopped in front of Daniel and looked at him the way a person looks at something that has appeared in the wrong place. Her eyes moved from Emma to the small puddle, to Daniel's face, to the general state of his clothing, and the assessment took less than 3 seconds. "This isn't a playground," Vanessa said. Her voice was level, but there was no warmth behind it. Daniel was about to respond when Vanessa reached across the reception desk, picked up a full glass of water that had been sitting there for a staff member, and threw it directly into his face. The gesture was fast and deliberate. The water hit him across the chest and neck and soaked into his shirt. Emma made a small sound and stepped back. The floor around the reception desk went quiet. 2 customers near the window turned to look. A sales associate nearby stared at the floor. "I think you're in the wrong place," Vanessa said, still in that same controlled tone. "Take your daughter and go before you make more of a mess." The room stayed quiet. No one objected. No one stepped forward. The couple near the window looked away. The associate who had been watching looked down at his phone. The floor returned to its curated silence, as if the entire exchange had simply been absorbed into the walls. Jason was across the room when it happened. He had seen all of it. He crossed the floor in a few seconds, pulling a handful of paper towels from the counter near the water station, and handed them to Daniel, without a word of justification or apology on Vanessa's behalf. Then he crouched down to Emma's level and asked her quietly if she was okay. Emma looked at him for a moment and gave a small nod. Daniel dried his face and the front of his shirt. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the other customers or the associates who had looked away. He looked only at Vanessa, and what was in his expression was not anger. It was something quieter and more certain than anger. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, "you'll understand what respect is worth." Vanessa held his gaze for exactly 1 second, before dismissing him with a slight turn of her head, already moving back toward her client. Daniel lifted Emma back onto his hip and started toward the exit. He stopped once beside Jason, who was still standing near the reception desk. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out a small white envelope. He placed it in Jason's hand with a steady grip. And when he spoke, his voice was low enough that it didn't carry. "You were the only one who asked if she was okay," Daniel said. "Get this to your director. Not now, after the floor clears. Make sure no one's watching." Jason looked down at the envelope. It was sealed plain, no writing on the outside. When he looked up, Daniel was already walking toward the door, Emma's head resting against his shoulder. Her small hand curled around the collar of his wet shirt. Jason stood there holding the envelope and understanding with a clarity that surprised him that he was being asked to make a choice. He could set it down somewhere, let someone else deal with it, keep himself out of whatever this was. That was the safe option. That was what the floor had taught him to do. Stay neutral, protect your position, don't involve yourself in things that don't concern you. Or he could do what the man had asked. He didn't know what was in the envelope. He didn't know who that man was. He knew only what he had seen a man and his daughter treated like they didn't deserve basic courtesy, and one person in the entire building who had thought to ask if the child was all right. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket and went back to work. The floor cleared out by 6:30. The last customer left through the front glass doors, and the sales associates began shutting down their workstations and collecting their things. The showroom lights dimmed to their after-hours setting, still bright enough to illuminate the cars, but with that particular emptiness that large commercial spaces have when the people are gone. Vanessa had stayed late, as she often did, working through end-of-day figures in her office. Mark was still at his desk. Jason moved through the floor, straightening brochures he had already straightened twice, waiting. He had carried the envelope in his jacket pocket for 9 hours. He had thought about it during every customer interaction, every lull between appointments, every time he passed the spot near the reception desk where the water had spread across the marble floor that morning. He had not opened it. He had not told anyone about it. He had simply waited the way the man had asked him to until the floor was clear. Jason knocked on the frame of Mark's open office door and walked in when Mark looked up. He set the envelope on the desk without explanation. Mark looked at it, then at Jason, then picked it up and turned it over. There was nothing written on the outside. He opened it. The letter inside was a single page printed on clean white paper, formal in structure and direct in language. Jason watched Mark's expression shift as he read, not dramatically, but in the way a face changes when the ground underneath a person's assumptions quietly gives way. By the time Mark reached the bottom of the page, he had stopped breathing in any natural rhythm. He looked at the business card that had been tucked behind the letter. It read, Daniel Brooks, founder and principal shareholder, Aurora Automotive Group. Mark set the card down on his desk with the careful precision of a man trying very hard to appear calm. He thanked Jason, told him he could go home, and waited until Jason's footsteps had faded before he picked up his phone. Vanessa answered on the second ring. Mark told her to come to his office and close the door. She arrived within a minute, and he showed her the letter without saying anything first. She read it standing up, one hand resting on the edge of his desk. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the business card for a long moment. Okay, she said. So we handle it. Mark asked her what she meant by handle it. Vanessa sat down across from him and laid out the approach with a composure that under different circumstances would have been impressive. They would contact the company's legal department first thing in the morning, not because they had done anything technically actionable, but to be prepared. She would draft a formal letter of apology to be sent to the address on the letterhead, framing the incident as a miscommunication under high operational pressure. They would not admit to a pattern of behavior. They would not reference the customer service complaints that had been circulating internally. They would describe it as an isolated incident, an error in judgment, the kind of thing that could happen on a difficult day in a high-volume environment. It was damage control, not accountability, and Vanessa understood the difference perfectly. Mark listened to all of it and said he wasn't sure it would be enough. Vanessa told him it would be enough if they moved fast and controlled the language. She had handled difficult situations before. She had navigated complaints, smoothed over confrontations, talked her way through circumstances that had looked worse than this on the surface. This was manageable. The man had left without making a scene. He hadn't called anyone on the spot, hadn't recorded anything publicly, hadn't threatened legal action to her face. That meant there was still room to shape the narrative. What neither of them mentioned, what both of them were carefully not saying, was that the security cameras had been running all day as they always were, recording everything on the showroom floor. Jason had not gone home. He had walked to his car in the parking structure behind the building, sat in the driver's seat for a while, and then gone back inside through the side entrance, which he knew the code for. He had told himself he had forgotten something at his desk. He wasn't sure he believed that. He walked through the side corridor that ran along the back of Mark's office, and he heard their voices clearly through the wall, not every word, but enough. The phrase "isolated incident" came through twice. He heard Vanessa say we control the framing with the same flat confidence she used when closing a sale. Jason stood in the corridor and thought about the envelope he had carried for 9 hours. He thought about the man who had handed it to him and said nothing beyond what was necessary. He thought about Emma, who had looked up at him with those dark eyes and given him a small nod when he asked if she was okay, the kind of nod a child gives when they are trying to be brave about something they don't fully understand. He thought about all the customers he had watched get quietly redirected or ignored on that floor. In the 3 months he had been there, people who didn't fit the visual profile of the clientele. Vanessa wanted people who had left without buying anything and without saying why. He went to his desk, opened his laptop, and spent 45 minutes writing a detailed account of everything he had witnessed: the spill, the exchange, the water thrown, the silence of the floor, every word he had heard clearly in that corridor. He included a formal request for the security footage from the showroom's internal system to be reviewed by the executive team. He found the direct reporting contact for Aurora Automotive Group's corporate compliance division on the company's internal portal, an address that existed precisely for situations like this, and that most employees at the dealership level had never needed to use. He sent the report, closed his laptop, and drove home. At 8:15 the following morning, a dark sedan pulled into the Luxora Motors parking lot, followed by a second vehicle. Daniel Brooks stepped out of the first car wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, the same quiet expression he had worn the previous morning, except that there was nothing uncertain about his presence now. 2 members of the Aurora Automotive Group executive board walked with him. A corporate attorney came from the second vehicle. They entered through the front door together. The showroom had been open for less than 20 minutes. 2 associates were with early customers. Jason was at his desk near the window. He looked up when the door opened and recognized Daniel immediately. The same face, the same eyes, the same unhurried way of moving through a room. He stood up without thinking. Vanessa had spotted the group from across the floor. She had spent the previous night preparing for exactly this possibility, and she crossed toward them now with the polished composure of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in her head until it felt manageable. She extended her hand to Daniel and began speaking before he had fully stopped walking, her voice measured, warm, professional. She told him she was glad he had come back, that she had reflected on yesterday's exchange, and wanted to express sincerely how sorry she was for any distress caused, that it had been an extremely demanding week, and she had responded in a way that did not reflect the standards of Luxora Motors or her own values as a professional. Daniel let her finish. Then he said, "The security footage from yesterday has already been pulled." Vanessa's hand, still extended, came down slowly. Mark was called out of his office. The full staff of the showroom sales associates, reception floor supervisors, was gathered near the center of the floor between the cars. The security footage was played on the large display screen that the showroom normally used for product presentations. There was no commentary. The camera angle was wide and clear. It showed the spill, small and unremarkable, a child's water bottle on a marble floor. It showed Vanessa walking over. It showed the reach across the reception desk. The glass lifted the water thrown. It showed Daniel standing there with water soaking through his shirt. It showed Emma stepping back. It showed every person on that floor who had looked away. And it showed Jason crossing toward them with a handful of paper towels, crouching down to Emma's level. The room was completely still. Vanessa stood at the edge of the group with her arms at her sides, watching herself on the screen. There was nothing to reframe. There was no version of the language that could reshape what the footage showed. She had spent 16 hours constructing an architecture of justification, and it had taken one sentence to dissolve it entirely. Daniel spoke to the group directly and without theatrics. He said this was not the standard that Aurora Automotive Group held its locations to, that it had never been the standard, and that it would not be going forward. Then he delivered the decisions that had been formalized that morning with the executive board. Mark Reynolds was relieved of his director position, effective immediately, and reassigned to a customer service oversight role at the corporate level, a role with no floor authority and direct accountability to the compliance team. Vanessa Cole was placed on suspension, with pay pending a formal conduct review, with a strong recommendation from the board that her contract be terminated at the conclusion of that process. Jason Miller was appointed interim floor manager, effective that same day. The staff dispersed slowly in the way people move when they've witnessed something that has shifted the structure of the room they're standing in. Mark walked to his office to collect the things he would need and left the rest. Vanessa said nothing. She walked down the short hallway off the main floor to the small staff lounge at the back of the building, the room with the table and the chairs and the coffee machine that was always slightly too loud. She sat down. Everyone else was gone. For the first time in 6 years, there was no floor to manage, no client to read, no performance to calibrate. There was only the room and the quiet and the version of herself that the security footage had put on that screen for everyone to see. She had watched herself walk across the floor with that particular authority she had always taken pride in, and she had watched what it looked like from the outside, not power, not professionalism, but contempt. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that has been practiced so long it feels like instinct. She kept coming back to one image, not from the screen, but from her own memory of the previous morning. Emma's face when the water hit her father. The child hadn't cried. She hadn't understood what she was seeing, not in the way an adult would understand it, with language and context and the ability to name what was wrong. She had simply looked at her father with an expression that asked without words, why would someone do that? That question, unspoken by a 6-year-old who had done nothing more than drop a water bottle, was the one thing that Vanessa's prepared language had no answer for. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the answer was simple, and it was not one she was ready to say out loud yet. She sat in the empty staff lounge for a long time before she got up and walked to her car. The first week under Jason's interim management was not clean. It was not a moment of collective reset, where the staff looked at their new leader and decided as one to do better. It was uncomfortable, uneven, and in some moments, quietly hostile. 3 of the senior associates had been at Luxora Motors for more than 4 years. They had watched Jason make his way through his first 90 days, had corrected him in front of customers, had left him out of conversations that happened in the corner of the break room. Now they were expected to copy him on their weekly reports. The adjustment was not graceful. Jason held the first staff meeting on his 3rd morning as interim manager. He kept it short. He did not make a speech about culture or values or the kind of dealership they were going to become. He said the floor would operate with one standard for every customer who walked through the door, regardless of what they were wearing or what they drove. He said that was not a new policy. It was the policy that had existed on paper since the day the showroom opened, and that going forward, it would also exist in practice. Then he asked if there were questions, and when there were none, he ended the meeting and went back to work. He understood that the authority the executive board had given him was real, but that authority on paper and authority in a room full of people who didn't respect you were 2 different things. He had to build the second kind himself, and he knew the only way to do that was to show up the same way every day until the consistency itself became undeniable. Daniel did not visit the floor during those first 2 weeks. He received daily reports from the corporate compliance team, which had placed Luxora Motors under a temporary performance review, and he read them every evening. He was watching for something specific, not the numbers, which would take longer to reflect any real change, but the nature of the complaints and the pattern of the interactions being logged. He wanted to see whether Jason was leading from principle or from the temporary leverage of an appointment. Those were different things, and they produced different results, and Daniel had learned over 20 years of building Aurora Automotive Group that you could not tell the difference from a distance. You had to watch the small decisions. What the reports showed him across those 2 weeks was consistent. Jason had intervened twice when associates had visibly deprioritized customers who didn't fit the showroom's preferred profile. He had handled a complaint from a customer who had been given incorrect pricing information not by passing it to the corporate line, but by sitting with the customer directly until the issue was resolved. He had not used his new position to rearrange the hierarchy for his own comfort. He was doing the job as if the job were simply the job, not a stage. That was what Daniel had been waiting to see. Daniel returned to Luxora Motors on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, dressed the way he had been the first time, no suit, no entourage. He asked a receptionist to let Jason know he was there. Jason came out from the back office and shook his hand, and the two of them sat in the small conference room off the main floor that had previously been used for manager meetings. Daniel spoke without preamble. He told Jason that he had started Aurora Automotive Group 22 years ago with nothing except a business plan that 3 banks had rejected and 1 that hadn't. Before that, before any of it, he had been a mechanic in Detroit, working long hours for a wage that kept him current on rent, but not much beyond that. He had saved for 8 months to have enough for a down payment on a reliable used car for his wife, who had been commuting an hour and 40 minutes each way to her job by bus in all weather. He had walked into a dealership in Detroit with $200 in his pocket, enough to hold a vehicle, and before he had spoken to a single salesperson, a manager had approached him and told him in front of his wife that the inventory they had available was probably outside his budget, and that there were other lots down the road that might be more suitable. They had not asked what his budget was. They had looked at his clothes and made the calculation for him. His wife had taken his hand, and they had walked out without a word. She had died 2 years later from a diagnosis that came too late, in the way diagnoses sometimes do when people defer the appointments, because the cost of being wrong feels too high. He had built Aurora Automotive Group in the years that followed, and he had carried that afternoon in Detroit with him through every acquisition, every expansion, every internal policy meeting about customer service standards. It was the reason he still walked into his own locations unannounced. It was the reason he had been in Luxora Motors on a Tuesday morning in a plain white shirt with his daughter on his hip. Jason listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that follows something that has been said for the first time in a long time and needs a breath of space. Daniel told Jason about the foundation. Aurora Automotive Group had been funding it quietly for 3 years, a community initiative designed to help working adults with limited income access reliable transportation. Not charity in the way the word was often used, but structured support, low-interest vehicle financing, employment-based qualification criteria, maintenance partnerships with independent shops. It operated in 4 cities and was due to expand. Daniel said he was looking for someone to help run the community engagement side of the program, someone who understood what it felt like to be in a room where you weren't sure you were welcome, and who knew how to change that room from the inside. He asked Jason to think about whether that was something he wanted to be part of. Jason said he didn't need to think about it. The conduct review concluded at the end of the 3rd week. The recommendation from the corporate compliance team was termination. The footage was unambiguous. The pattern of behavior documented in the internal complaints was consistent, and there was no procedural basis on which to argue the outcome. Vanessa was informed of the decision by letter, as was standard. She did not contest it. What happened next was not in any process document. 10 days after receiving the termination letter, Vanessa Cole walked back into Luxora Motors on a Wednesday morning when the floor was open and moderately busy. She was not dressed in the sharp professional clothing she had worn as manager. She wore plain work clothes, nothing designed to signal anything. She asked the receptionist if she could speak with Jason Miller, and she waited in one of the chairs near the entrance, the same chairs where customers sat while their paperwork was processed. Jason came out, and they stood near the window, far enough from the floor that the conversation was private. Vanessa did not have the fluid composure she had always carried on that floor. She looked like someone who had spent several weeks sitting with something difficult and had come in not because she expected a particular outcome, but because she needed to say what she had come to say. She told him she wasn't there to ask for her job back or to dispute the review. She said she had spent a long time in those weeks thinking about what she had actually done, not the version she had constructed that night in Mark's office, with the language about operational pressure and miscommunication, but the actual thing. She said she had looked at a man who walked in with his daughter on a Tuesday morning, assessed him in under 3 seconds, and decided he didn't belong in a space that she treated as her own. She said she had thrown water on a person in front of his child, because in that moment, his presence had felt like an inconvenience to her image of the floor, and she had not stopped to ask herself a single question about who he was or what his life looked like. She said she was not apologizing because she had lost her job. She said, "I looked at a father and only saw his clothes." Jason received this without filling the space immediately. He told her that the decision about her employment had been made at a level above him and that he wasn't in a position to reverse it. Then he said that the foundation Daniel had asked him to help expand was looking for people who understood from personal experience what it cost to be dismissed, and that if she was serious about starting over, there might be a place for that. Not at Luxora Motors, not yet, but somewhere that the work would be harder and more honest than managing a floor that ran on appearances. Vanessa said she understood. She thanked him and left. Daniel heard about the exchange from Jason the following week. He said nothing for a moment, then nodded once, not as approval of a business decision, but as recognition of something more human than that. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper, handwritten small and plain, and handed it to Jason. The note said, "Never forget who you are when no one knows who you are yet." Jason read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. 6 weeks after the morning, Daniel Brooks had walked into Luxora Motors in a plain white shirt with his daughter on his hip. The showroom floor looked the same as it always had. The polished cars, the cool air, the brushed chrome surfaces. But the temperature of the room had changed. In the way rooms change, when the unspoken rules are rewritten, and the people in them begin to operate differently, because they've seen what the alternative looks like from the outside. On a Friday morning, Jason was standing near the reception desk, reviewing a delivery schedule, when the front door opened. A man walked in alone. He was wearing work clothes, a canvas jacket, heavy-duty boots, with dried mud at the sole, the look of someone who had come directly from a job site without stopping to change. He moved a little uncertainly the way people do when they're not sure they'll be treated well in a place that doesn't look like them. Jason set down the paperwork and walked across the floor before anyone else moved. He extended his hand, looked the man in the eye, and said, "Hi there. How can I help you today?" The man's expression shifted a small thing, a slight release of the tension in his shoulders, the kind of response that happens when someone receives basic human courtesy in a place where they weren't expecting it. They walked together toward the floor, and Jason let the man lead, moving at whatever pace he chose, looking at whatever he wanted to look at for as long as he needed. No calculation, no assessment, no decision made in the first 3 seconds about whether this person belonged. Outside, the California light pressed flat and bright against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Inside, something that had been wrong for a long time was in this small moment simply right.